Breaking tonight, 26 people confirmed dead after a shooting inside a church in Texas. We'll bring you everything you need to know about this tragic event, including new information this hour on the background of the shooter. We'll also bring you live from Japan any latest developments from the important visit of the president to Asia. Evening, everyone. Welcome to The Next Revolution. I'm Steve Hilton, and this is usually the home of positive populism. But there is nothing positive about the news today from Texas. The investigation just underway tonight into the shooting during services inside the First Baptist Church in Sutherland, Texas. That's about 30 miles southeast of San Antonio. As we've said, at least 26 people are now confirmed dead. One of the victims just 5 years old. And some 10 or more are injured. The attacker himself, identified as 26-year-old Devin Kelly, also shot dead after fleeing the church in a vehicle. And we're learning just within the hour that Kelly had been discharged from the U.S. Air Force. President Trump speaking about the shooting tonight while on his historic trip to Asia, and that's the other big story we'll be covering here on this show tonight. The president's meeting with the Emperor of Japan and the Prime Minister during this hour. Here's what he said from Japan this evening about the tragedy in Texas.
I've spoken just a few minutes ago with Governor Abbott, and we offer our thanks to the first responders, the FBI, all of the many people involved, both federal and otherwise. Ultimately, they stopped the suspect and rendered immediate life-saving aid to certain victims of the shooting. I will continue to follow the developments closely. All of America is praying to God to help the wounded and the families of the victims. We will never, ever leave their side. Ever.
Let's bring in our panel now. Tonight, I'm joined by co-host of Fox & Friends Weekend and Fox News contributor Pete Hegseth, and Democratic strategist and Fox News contributor Jessica Tarlov. Also joining me here is Brian Levin, professor of criminal justice at Cal State San Bernardino. Brian, thank you for joining us here on short notice. I'd like to start with you. If you could just, for our audience, please, going to break down how we should be thinking about this in the context of other events like this. What should our audience be really focusing on?
Well, we have to look at the type of mass assailants who do these symbolic killings. Number one, we have the political or religious. They're under the ideologically motivated. Or we have number two, people who are psychologically dangerous. They range from sociopaths all the way to high-functioning paranoid schizophrenics. Some people are cognitively impaired. And third, personal benefit or revenge, and you can have a mix and match between these three, but usually one predominates. My guess, and this is early on, is that this is someone who is unstable but seeking some type of revenge, felt that he was disrespected in some way and was getting back at an institution or society.
So none of that, frankly, makes any difference, obviously, to the people directly touched and affected by something like this. But should it give us a different way of thinking about it, depending on which type of attack it turns out to be?
Yes, and no matter what the motivation, in 30 to 40% of these cases, researchers have found there's some kind of leakage, either through social media, something verbally to friends, they're amassing weapons, or they have a grievance which they are affixed to. And we've been hearing this for a variety of different mass attacks, including some of the information coming out from the sheriff in Las Vegas suggesting, for instance, that Paddock had suffered massive financial losses. So oftentimes there's an idiosyncratic component where people feel that they've been emasculated and they're going to get their reputation back through an act of violence. We're living in an era today where we have a celebritization of violence and people think that they can make a name for themselves after being disrespected oftentimes through these kind of violent acts.
That's pretty horrific stuff about the state of our culture. Pete, I'll turn to you on this. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's obviously a terrible situation. But we live in a free society, and you can't guard every church, every school to the level you would like to deal with someone who's going to dress in all black with a body armor and a semi-automatic rifle and decide that they're going to, with some level of training, we know he was in the Air Force, dishonorably discharged, which means he had his issues while in the Air Force. You can't guard against all of that. So as tragic as it is, it shouldn't unleash necessarily a set of reactions that lead to an overburdensome reaction from the government or others. I would also note it was a free citizen who was armed himself or herself outside the church that ultimately stopped this attack as well.
I just think we should just make clear that while we have had it confirmed that he was discharged from the Air Force, the circumstances of his discharge are still being speculated on, and we're not 100% sure what those circumstances are. But when they do become clear, I'm sure that'll illuminate some of the points perhaps that you've been making. Jessica, what's your reaction?
My reaction is, first of all, how disturbing this is and that it's such a common occurrence. Before the show began, we talked about how I was sitting in a green room, just a week ago, right before the terror attack in New York, where I'm from, and that Las Vegas was actually only 5 weeks ago, which it seems like an eternity. And I'm not sure really where the conversation has gone from that, because the whole nation was up in arms, and we had word that the NRA wanted to ban bump stocks and the like, and now that conversation is absolutely gone. To your point, in the rush to judgment and the rush to change laws, I will play stereotypical liberal right now and say that the president's reaction to what happened in New York City last week was a lot louder and a lot crazier than what just happened today. We saw a very subdued president, thoughts and prayers, which I think is incredibly important, and I send mine as well to the families and to the victims wherever they are right now. But at the same time, I don't know why we have a different reaction to someone who was armed with a weapon that he should not have had, no matter the circumstances of what happened.
Rifle is.
But he was clearly mentally unstable.
When you get to the end of your argument, and I want to come back on one aspect of it, but keep going.
Absolutely. I think that anyone would say that if someone is going to walk into a house of worship and murder over 20 people, including young children, that there is something wrong with them and they should not have the ability to get their hands on a gun like that. I understand we'll find out if he got it illegally, and we can't stop all of that. But as the former president, tweeted this evening, President Obama said, I hope that we have the strength to take concrete steps to make sure that we can prevent as many of these tragedies as possible.
Well, look, I think that it depends on what news we get during this hour, and whether there's new information to bring our audience, frankly, whether we'll have time to get into some of those conversations. And I know there are a lot of people who feel that actually it is still too early to talk about that. And I know there's a response on the other side that it's just, and this is the point I wanted to pick up on, which is, well, it's not too early in the view of some to talk very soon after a terror attack about that. So I just wanted to make one point in distinction there, which is that there is one crucial difference, which is that in the case of a terror attack, it is very obviously, very quickly, the result of a war being waged against us, an ideological war, which does put it in a different category from the different circumstances we see, as Brian was pointing out, with these kinds of events. But what do you think about, Pete, the speed at which people take a tragedy like this and then go to the potential policy solutions?
Oftentimes the speed at which the motives are revealed. If someone's yelling Allahu Akbar with an ISIS flag in their truck when they commit it, it's quite clear that there's an ideologically radically Islamic motive behind it. In this particular case, we don't know. Maybe we'll know quickly what the motivation, as disturbed as it may be, of the shooter is. But I think you're exactly right. An ideological war being waged against us and tactics being used here motivated Islamists to attack us. It doesn't change whether 26 are dead here or 26 are dead there, but it has a larger impact on the way we react to it, as opposed to citizens who may be disturbed, as terrible as it may be, but may have a lawful
as a type of ideology problem. I mean, and that's
not the same level of a war being waged against us by radical Islamists.
Mental illness is such an enormous problem for our country, and I feel that our congressmen and our senators are far too slow and unwilling to act upon that so that we can prevent tragedies like this. No one who shoots up a church is sane.
I think that funnily enough, that part of it, doing something more about mental illness, is somewhere where you might have some unity. I just
and some bipartisan agreement there. But
just
then,
before we break, I just wanted to see if you had anything, Brian, to add to that question about action around the mental illness part of this.
Of course, there has to be action around the mental illness part, but like a physician, we have to look at the whole body. And the fact of the matter is we've seen with Dylan Roof and we've seen with others, people who had no right to have these kinds of weapons. Indeed, Antonin Scalia, who wrote the decision in the Heller case, said in protecting the right of having a handgun in the home. He said that the Second Amendment doesn't necessarily
interrupt you, Brian, just for a second for our audience to say this is live pictures now from Japan with the president with the emperor there. Sorry, just to explain what our viewers are seeing.
And thank you for having me. But look, as we've seen, our community in San Bernardino, people who had access to firearms that shouldn't have had access to it. So you got to look at both sides. Bottom line, though, it's very interesting. If we look at the number of casualties from long rifles, of which this type of firearm was a subset, we see relatively few homicides to the whole nexus of firearm-related homicides. Most people are killed by handguns, and that's a big part of the problem. But as I said, Antonin Scalia said that the Second Amendment is not a bar with respect to having somebody not have access under all circumstances to any kind of weapon. So the bottom line is the Second Amendment, like all fundamental rights, does not protect every circumstance and everybody from getting any kind of weapon they want. This is a political issue, not a constitutional one.
I'm sure we'll get to some of those points later. We're going to have to take a break now. We're continuing to monitor the events in Sutherland, Texas, as well as across the world in Japan, as you just saw, where the President and the First Lady are meeting with the Emperor and the Prime Minister. The panel and I are coming back in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back to The Next Revolution. Of course, we're monitoring the tragedy still unfolding in Texas, where a gunman opened fire inside a Baptist church about 30 miles southeast of San Antonio and killed at least 26 people. The latest from the ground right there is coming up. In the meantime, President Trump is said to be monitoring the situation there very closely while on his historic trip to Asia. The president in Japan at this hour, and now John Roberts is there right now live. He joins us from Tokyo. John, obviously this is a big disruption to the president's intentions for this trip. How much has changed in terms of his focus and those of his hosts there in Japan?
Steve, good morning to you from Tokyo. Clearly, this has taken up a lot of the president's thinking in the last few hours. He is sticking to his schedule, though. You showed just a few minutes ago, and I don't know if we got them again, pictures of President Trump and the First Lady with Emperor Akihito and the Empress Michiko meeting at the Imperial Palace here in downtown Tokyo, one of the most spectacular places that you've ever seen in the center of the city. Important to note, too, that the Emperor and his Empress have been married now for almost 60 years. They'll celebrate their 60th wedding anniversary in 2019. He has held the throne for almost 30 years, and it is tradition for every American president who comes to Tokyo to visit with the Emperor and the Empress. Now, as for President Trump's response to the shooting in Sutherland Springs, a short time ago, he was giving an address at the U.S. Embassy here in Tokyo to U.S. and Japanese business leaders when he sounded a very somber note off the top of his remarks. Let's listen here.
We cannot begin to imagine the suffering of those who lost the ones they so dearly loved. Americans do what they do best. We pull together. We join hands, we lock arms, and through the tears and through the sadness, we stand strong, oh so strong. My administration will provide its full support to the great state of Texas and all local authorities investigating this horrible crime.
And it was just a little more than a month ago that President Trump made condolence remarks following that horrific shooting in Las Vegas back there on October the 1st. The president would later go to Las Vegas to visit with some of the families of the victims and meet some of the victims who were in the hospital recovering from their grievous wounds. And as he did when he addressed the situation in Las Vegas, the president today used very much the same language and again praised the first responders who responded so quickly and so effectively to the shooting there at the church in Sutherland Springs. Let's listen to what else the president said.
I will continue to follow the developments closely. All of America is praying to God to help the wounded and the families of the victims. We will never, ever leave their side, ever.
We will never, ever leave their side, ever. Those exact words were spoken about the victims and the survivors and the family members of the people who were so grievously wounded in the Las Vegas shooting back there again on October the 1st. We also heard from the former president, Barack Obama, who weighed in on the shooting on Twitter, saying, quote, "We grieve with all the families in Sutherland Springs harmed by this act of hatred and will stand with the survivors as they recover. May God also grant all of us the wisdom to ask what concrete steps we can take to reduce the violence and weaponry in our midst." There are calls already, Steve, from many people on the Democratic side of the political aisle to start up the debate again about gun control. Some people saying how many lives will have to be lost. We heard John Lewis, congressman from Georgia, say that in the aftermath of Las Vegas, how many lives will have to be lost before we finally decide to get a handle on the proliferation of these powerful, powerful weapons in the United States of America. The president certainly staying away from that argument, at least for the time being, though after Las Vegas there were calls, and even the NRA supported calls to ban those so-called bump stocks or slide fire stocks that allowed the shooter in Las Vegas to shoot so quickly so many rounds of ammunition. We do not know whether or not the shooter in Sutherland Springs had a slide fire or bump stock on his weapon, but certainly he took a lot of lives with him there earlier today. Steve?
Thank you, John. Sorry to interrupt you a little bit earlier. I just was interested there in the remarks from President Obama. They seem to be much more of a kind of subtle way into the argument than we saw after Las Vegas from, for example, Hillary Clinton. And they certainly echo the kind of approach, I think, other Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi, sort of talking about action but not getting as political as Hillary Clinton did and was really condemned for straight after Las Vegas. Just while you're with us, I wanted to ask one more question, if I may, about the Asia trip. A lot of people interested in what probably is at the top of the agenda, North Korea. How much of the trip will also focus on trade, and how are those two things going to be connected in the president's and his team's eyes as the trip unfolds?
Well, really, Steve, the overarching issue here is, in the president's trip is North Korea. He's talking with Shinzo Abe about that today when they have a bilateral meeting after the president finishes up with the emperor and the empress. It'll be the dominant topic of conversation when he meets with President Moon Jae-in in South Korea. It will be another big topic of conversation with Xi Jinping, again at the APEC conference when he's expected to meet with Vladimir Putin in Da Nang in Vietnam, and then the ASEAN conference in Manila, winding up the president's trip. But trade is also very, very important as well, because the United States has got trade deficits with all 5 countries that the president will be visiting. The biggest, of course, with China, but there are significant trade deficits that the United States runs with Japan and with South Korea, to the point in South Korea that the president is talking about ripping up the chorus, the free trade agreement, and starting all over again. And we heard the president earlier today when he was addressing the U.S. and Japanese business leaders, saying that we want free, fair, and reciprocal trade with our allies, and trade between the United States and Japan is neither free nor fair nor reciprocal, and the president wants to change that. But I still think, Steve, that the big topic of conversation is North Korea, because we're down now to a point where many experts believe that our choices are in the zone of either the horrific or the catastrophic. And so the president really has to try to get something going in this visit to get Kim Jong-un to, at the very least, freeze his nuclear program and at best roll it back. Steve?
John, thanks so much for joining us. These are huge issues. It's a very long trip. We look forward to hearing your dispatches over the weeks ahead, because it is weeks. Thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Just want to come to you, Jessica, if I may, out of that report there of what Barack Obama was saying.
Right.
Moving us into the debate on guns, in the view of some, perhaps too quickly. What's your take on how he addressed the issue?
I think it was spot on. I don't mind the politicization of this, because I do think it is a political issue at this point, because our congressional leaders are the ones, I think, who can save us from a lot of this damage. But I thought he struck exactly the right tone, and I think that he has consistently done that. There are people, I believe, on both sides of the aisle, if they're being honest about it, who will agree that President Obama was certainly one of our best presidential orators. I mean, listening to him, whether you agreed with the content or not, he put things together well. He expressed them properly. I don't think anyone doubted his compassion for the people that he was talking about, or could have seen him down at the church in South Carolina singing Amazing Grace and doubted any of that. So I think it was exactly right, and I like the idea, as you put it, the subtlety of pushing an agenda. I think that's what we have to do, because there has been a narrative created by those on the right and the NRA that liberals are trying to take your guns. That's not what's happening here. We respect the Constitution, Second Amendment rights. What we're talking about is responsible gun ownership and expanding background checks and all of that wonderful stuff. So I think it was spot on.
I do hear people on your side of the argument make that point, and nevertheless, people are suspicious. They don't think it's just going to stop with some clever check that's going to help us with terrible events like we saw in Texas. That actually the real agenda is to take away people's guns.
Of course, that is the real agenda if they can go to a logical conclusion. Some may say that it isn't, but for many on the left, that's exactly where it is. And Jessica, I disagree. It's not political leaders in Washington that are going to save us here. It's individuals with their Second Amendment rights who can arm themselves and defend themselves at a moment where the county sheriff or the police can't be there. Maybe a background check would have disqualified this guy. Maybe not. Maybe he was otherwise a perfectly sane individual.
Hang on a second.
We don't know that yet. Maybe he would. Maybe not.
If he was, then he had it illegally in the first
Potentially,
place.
not potentially. Who knows? But even so, he could have illegally obtained these weapons. We live in a world where we have this right, and responsible gun ownership is the world we live in. So seeking, I think it's a very left-wing way of looking at the world, that it's going to be a political solution, some sort of a policy option in Washington that's going to somehow save us from the situation. No, we have to. We live in a free society where these things unfortunately happen, and the more armed citizens who arm themselves responsibly, I think the safer we are.
And Brian, you know, given what you were saying earlier about the powerful forces that drive someone to commit these acts, they're just unthinkable for most normal people to just behave like this.
Right.
What good would the kinds of policy measures be against maniacs, frankly, like this?
Well, let's look at the maniac that mowed down many people in my hometown of New York, where I served in the NYPD. The bottom line is, if I can respectfully kind of try and go in the middle here, is that fundamental rights like freedom of speech, interstate travel, and even marriage can be regulated, and so can gun ownership. And I think most people can agree that an inconvenience, perhaps, with respect to background checks or certain types of ammunition or certain types of high-capacity magazines should be on the table, at least for discussion. If we're going to approach this by saying every time we want some reasonable regulation, we're going to take guns away from people like myself and others who are law-abiding, I think that's a little bit of a red herring. We allow motor vehicles, but we don't allow people to go 200 miles an hour. And the bottom line is, if we can't necessarily keep the gun out of the hands of every unstable person, but reasonable checks and reasonable balances with regard to this right as well as others, I think would make a difference.
You hear that word a lot, reasonable, and it's, you know, in the eye of the beholder, or whatever the phrase is. How does technology affect some of this? Because frankly, when you've got the increasing ability, and it's just going to accelerate, of people to literally, you know, print guns at home with 3D printers and so on. Well, in the end, what use can government even begin to really stop this kind of event?
What you can do at the margins, look, we don't have a Second Amendment right to have a howitzer. And I think, for instance, on Capitol Hill, after our community was hit, and one of the victims went there, and they said, no, you know, mentally unstable people will still be covered, and then the politicians tried to even roll that back. Let's have some reasonable discussions about keeping guns out of the hands of felons, mentally unstable, and bottom line is, military type of weapons, there's not necessarily this broad right.
That's a point. We're going to have to sort of stop there for a second, but we'll come back to it. I think that the issue, I think, with a lot of them, I'm learning about this debate because it's a new debate for me. But I think one of the points that's very powerful with me when I listen to the debate is that actually it's very difficult for anyone to point to any specific item on the list of restrictions that people have in mind and say, well, that would have stopped this one. And I think that is a pretty big objection to a lot of the arguments that are made. But maybe we can get back to that in a second. Sorry, Brian, we have to stop there for the moment. Back in a second. More details on the breaking news we're following in Texas and overseas. The Next Revolution is back in a second. Welcome back to The Next Revolution. We're live in Los Angeles monitoring breaking developments in southern Texas after today's deadly mass shooting, and in Japan, where the President and First Lady are meeting with the Japanese Emperor and Prime Minister. But right now, let's get back to the shooting. Again, breaking out this morning inside the First Baptist Church in Sutherland, Texas. At least 26 people, as well as the gunman, are dead. Joining me now on the phone is Congressman Henry Cuellar, who represents the district in Sutherland, Texas, where this tragic shooting took place. Congressman, thanks for joining us. We do appreciate your time this evening.
Thank you so much.
Could you just give us your impressions of where the community stands this evening?
Well, first of all, this is a small community of less than 400 individuals. I've been there before. My office is there once a month to go provide services. They'll be there first thing at 8 o'clock in the morning. This is a small community with families where they send their kids off to school. They work there. It's a small community where everybody knows each other. So to have evil descent on this community in this way is something that nobody expected. And I think it's going to be a long time, for this families to get back together. They have to grieve. They have to heal. It's a strong, independent community. But again, this is a pretty hard blow that the community has received. But I feel confident that in the future they'll be able to bounce back.
So I think that one of the things that certainly struck me reading some of the testimony that we heard and from those in the community today was this point about, this is the kind of thing we expect somewhere else. We don't expect it here, maybe in a big city, but certainly not in our community. How does the fact that it's such a small town change people's attitude to questions like law enforcement and the response to events like this?
Well, you're right. I mean, this is an area that, if you think about it, you see this in big urban areas. We saw what happened in New York, just last week with some people being killed by somebody using a truck. So you just don't expect this in a small, little community where people know each other. Tomorrow morning, when more of the names are released of the victims, they're going to know everybody. This is not names in the abstract where people don't know each other. They are going to know each other. I've been on the phone with the sheriff who's doing a good job, Sheriff Joe Tackett. I've been on the phone with, Commissioner Albert Gomez. I've been on the phone with other folks that have been telling me what's been happening, who's who, people that work at the county, kids. The schools are going to be, setting up counseling tomorrow because of, the different kids that got killed, young kids that got killed that are not going to be showing up at school tomorrow. So this is a blow to the community. It's hard, but it's a strong community because I've been there. I see how people, get together and support each other. And we're going to do everything we can to help this community heal. But it is going to take a little bit of time. It's when you have evil descent in this way, it's a heavy blow. But I have faith in this community. God will be, there to make make the people stronger. Talking about God, this happened in a worship place, in a church, which just makes it horrible.
I know, and I think that's one of the things that makes it just so totally shocking. One last question. You're going to be heading, I think, back up to D.C., I think tomorrow. What are you going to be saying to your colleagues in Washington who don't have the personal connection that you have to this event?
Well, I've had different members of Congress that have reached out to me. Joe Crowley from New York, Pete Aguilar from California, Will Hurd from just one of my neighbors, Vicente Gonzalez. I've had Joaquin Castro. I've had a lot of folks that have reached out to me. I just reached out to Steve Scalise, and he sent me his prayers to the community. We're going to, I asked him if we can set up a moment of silence on the House floor for our community. He's going to be talking to Speaker Ryan, which I'm sure that's going to happen this week. So it's everybody's getting together, and at the end of the week, I'm going to be there with the families in Sutherland. I'm going to invite some of my colleagues to be there with me so we can show support and be there for this community that's been stricken at this time. But we're going to do everything to be one voice, one family together in Sutherland Springs.
Well, we do appreciate that, and I think the whole country is with you in that effort. Thank you so much for what you're doing, and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much, and good night to you.
So our live coverage continues on this deadly shooting in Texas and the president's trip to Asia. We're back in a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to the next revolution. At least 26 people killed while worshipping in a Texas church, some 20 injured, and police right now trying to figure out why a former member of the U.S. Air Force opened fire. Here in Los Angeles, I'm joined live by retired LAPD Commander Rick Webb. Commander, thank you very much for being here. I just want to pick up on one aspect of this that I just touched on with the congressman there. The fact that this is such a small town, a tiny community. Their sense of law enforcement is so different from what your experience was at the LAPD. How do you think that affects how they would think about something like this?
Well, I think it's going to be a substantial impact on law enforcement there. I assume that many of the law enforcement people, first responders, possibly even the healthcare providers, live in the community. They're going to know people. They're possibly going to be working with the victims of this that they know, maybe even family members. So it's going to be very, very significant. The parallels between this and, say, the Newtown, Connecticut shooting are uncanny in that there's going to be a substantial amount of recovery that everybody's going to have to go through. 26 funerals. There's going to be hearses lined up and down the streets of that town, and it's going to be the recovery for these people is going to be very, very difficult. Law enforcement, particularly in smaller agencies, have to have a lot of mutual aid. Hopefully the chiefs of police, they have worked together and know each other and on a first-name basis so that they can go in and relieve each other, because a smaller law enforcement agency really just can't handle something of this size.
So one of the things that I wanted to get your expertise on is something that I've heard people talk about today in the light of a Facebook post that the killer made a few days ago. And the argument has been made, well, is it possible to do more to identify in advance potential atrocities like this by looking at social media? There's so much information out there. I've heard people say the tech firms should do more to try and help us prevent this kind of crime.
Well, I think there's certainly some technological capabilities out there. I'm not very familiar with exactly how they might scrub social media to get that, but the professor talked a little bit about leakage. Very few of these shootings take place without somebody somewhere knowing that this person might act. And there has to be programs in every state so that somebody that knows about this a potential attack notifies authorities. I know Colorado has a thing called Safe to Tell, where students can report potential shootings. And so if people have a leakage outlet, you might say, that would be very, very helpful. Unfortunately, when we look at something like Facebook or other social media, the rantings of people are just abhorrent, frankly, and it would be very difficult, I think, to ultimately pinpoint the exact shooter. Certainly, looking in the rearview mirror is much easier than looking down the road, but it would be nice if we could do that. I just don't know exactly how we would get that accomplished.
No, I do agree with you. Thank you for putting it like that, because I do think when something so awful happens, we're constantly looking at what could we do, what could have been done to prevent it, what can we do in the future, and the terrible truth is often the answer is nothing. Do appreciate your expertise this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. We're back live in a moment with new details on the shooting in Texas and the president's trip to... Welcome back, everybody. Let's wrap things up for our coverage with the panel. Pete, I just want to ask you to talk from your experience about the background of this guy, discharged from the Air Force. What do you make of it?
Discharged from the Air Force. Some reports say he may have been dishonorably discharged. Fox hasn't yet validated that. He was involved in logistics in the Air Force, which means he may have received some level of weapons training, but it doesn't mean he was a highly trained combat-hardened veteran, which is a difference, but you can go to ranges with weapon systems and become pretty proficient pretty quickly. Motivation and ideology is really going to be a big thing here. I mean, we always look for that. Is it an Islamist? Is it a racist? Is it an Antifa member? Who is it? What is their motivation? Rather than going straight to the weapon, which is what the left likes to do, go to the gun and say we need to remove it. Even if he was barred at some level because he was dishonorably discharged from gun ownership, he could have obtained this illegally as well.
Yes,
I imagine that's what happened here. And certainly I also read a report, and I don't know if Fox has confirmed it, that he had other weapons in his car as well. And when you look at someone like a Stephen Paddock, who had a room full of weaponry that he certainly was in no mental state to have, you know that there's a problem here. To your point saying, the left immediately goes to get rid of the gun, the left immediately goes to mental illness, quite frankly. And the thing that it unites all of these people is that they are not stable, and they should not have access to weapons that they can carry out these crimes with.
And there isn't an immediate red flag.
I just want to, Brian, that was one of your categories. We opened the show with your overview, the mental illness, the disturbed mind that does this. Is there anything? We were talking with Commander Webb about leakage and spotting the signs. Is there more that can be done, do you think?
Yes, and let's look at Sandy Hook, for instance, where the mom had the weapons. We have to address this holistically, and we have to address this as a community. One of the great things that I like about your show is you have all different viewpoints. I think reasonable people can say, at the very least, people who are adjudicated felons or who may have been court-martialed, people who have determined to have mental illness, those are folks that we should keep weaponry away from, particularly weapons of war. And again, we can regulate dangerous people. And I think we should look at, though, also the weaponry, because one of the things that we're seeing now...
just again, second time it's happened, just want to explain to our audience what's going on over there in Japan. The president with the prime minister there. Sorry, I did literally interrupt your flow, but keep going.
Sure. So one of the things I think we have to do is have some common sense approach to this. As I said, our community was impacted by this. We had one of the victims' families go to D.C., and they were even given a difficult time with respect to mentally ill people having access to this. And we saw with our San Bernardino attack that there was a straw purchaser who will be sentenced for supplying the terrorist with the weapon. And we have to, at least on the things we can agree upon, keeping these out of the hands of dangerous people, I think we all...
We do have widespread agreement. I mean, we have over 90% of Americans polling that they would like tougher background checks. And when you talk about a Dylan Roof and what closing the Charleston loophole would do, if you have to wait a couple extra days to get your hands on a weapon like this, just so that we can prevent someone like Dylan Roof walking into a church and murdering, I think it was 13 people, I think that should be worthwhile for every American, whether you're a gun owner or not.
Pete,
we wouldn't have prevented the Las Vegas attack, though. I mean, there wasn't anything immediately
well, that we
in his
know
background.
We've actually totally stopped talking about Las Vegas at this point.
But I'm just saying
that you story has gone away.
How far do you go on evaluating the mental health or capabilities of certain people beyond a criminal background?
I think. I just want to understand. Hang on a second. I don't want to go back to the.
I love government
the weapons. I want to talk about the underlying issue, the mental health issue, because we keep talking about that as a kind of headline. We use that phrase. What do we mean in terms of services locally for people with mental health problems? Who's at fault here, or if anyone? Is it a local government issue? Is it something to do with
even the military doesn't have its arms
medical
around
services?
Well, obviously not. If this, this guy is a veteran.
Well,
right?
He may or may not suffer from post-traumatic stress. We don't know if he served in a combat zone or not. But even within the military mental health services, you got a single-payer healthcare system in the VA that's supposed to provide this, and they can't do it, let alone evaluate it on the civilian side. You said you're in favor of government intrusion. How far are we going to go in evaluating the mental health of people and whether or not they have a fundamental right of the Second Amendment?
This is so interesting
it's like a writing
to me.
test
The counter argument.
Have the First Amendment.
How far are we going to go?
Or you don't.
Right, because to go back to what happened last week in the terror attack in New York, there was immediate calls for this extreme vetting. Right, how far will we go to make sure that we are at war? Right, but we also treat Muslims as if they are foreigners. This man was American.
I don't think that's a fair comment at all.
I really do. When you look at the way that these shootings are treated, we treat a white American man, American-born, as a completely different beast than someone who carries out an attack in the name of Islam. And I take your point, but you look at the Pulse nightclub
hang on,
shooter,
sorry, Jessica. So I want to get right at the beginning, and I thought very helpfully, Brian set out for us that you've got these different types of motivation, and one of them is ideological, and that's what you're seeing in the case of the Islamist terror, and that's why I do think it's different. It's not just about.
But why wouldn't we leap at the
health.
chance to
It's a
make
different
sure?
case.
Of course it is, but I'm saying these are all people who are carrying out mass atrocities. So why are we not as anxious to make sure that people who are mentally ill get the treatment that they need as we are to ban people from coming to this country who might carry out an attack in the name of Islam?
I'm afraid we're out of time. Let's just all agree it's a terrible and tragic day today. I appreciate your spirited
with our
debate.
Christian friends and our friends in Texas.
Thank you to all of you for being here, and thanks to you at home for joining us. I'm Steve Hilton. See you next Sunday when the next revolution will be televised. But Fox News is continuing coverage of